Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ASFPM 2021 G4 session. My name is Kevin Donnelly, and I'm pleased to be moderating this session focusing on the risk map lifecycle. I'm a principal at Stantec, a member of the STARR 2 joint venture, and a water resource engineer and project manager. I've been working with the National Flood Insurance Program for over 20 years, and I'm currently supporting FEMA Region 3 as the STARR 2 PTS Task Order Manager and Regional Production Lead. I'm excited to be a part of this session as my life has been very intertwined in the risk map lifecycle, it feels like, since its inception. We have three outstanding presentations to share with you today. But before we get started, a big thank you to our ASFPM session G4 sponsor, ENV-SP Geospatial.
Acquire, analyze, answer. At ENV-SP Geospatial, we provide floodplain management data and analytics to mitigate risk, plan for growth, manage resources, and advance scientific understanding. It all starts with quality data. And when river engineers take on a project relying on LiDAR data and analytics, they cross their fingers that it's ENV-SP Geospatial data. We're pioneers and innovators in topobathymetric LiDAR survey and analysis, with expertise in hydrography, including flow path and HECRAS, inundation modeling, floodwater risk assessment, and change detection. We perform vegetation classification, including riparian, submerged, and overhanging vegetation, as well as habitat analysis such as sun shade, log jams, and coarse woody debris mapping. When you think floodplain management mapping, think ENV-SP Geospatial.
Great, and now we have our first presentation today entitled The Third-Party Data and the Golden Triangle, Cost, Schedule, and Quality. Our presenters today are Taylor Grove, Sydney Rao, and Matt McGlone. Ms. Taylor Grove is a water resource engineer who has delved into the world of project management. She's worked extensively with H&H models and interfaces and supported FEMA appeal submissions. Taylor now focuses her efforts on creating a symbiotic golden triangle in her work whenever possible. Sydney Rao is with CDM Smith, has 9 years of experience supporting FEMA's risk mapping, assessment, and planning program. She serves as Deputy RPS Manager for FEMA Region 6 and the MIT Black Belt for FEMA Region 1 and FEMA Region 6. And Matt McGlone, also with CDM Smith, is a certified floodplain manager and project manager who has over 10 years of experience on FEMA mapping projects, including both map modernization and risk map phases. He's currently the Regional Technical Coordinator for FEMA Region 8. Quick reminder to everyone, please submit questions as you think of them in the box, and they'll be available for our presenters to respond following the presentation. Thanks, and enjoy the presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for being with us virtually today at Session G. We're excited to present on third-party data in the Golden Triangle as we explore the aspects of cost, time, and quality. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment for us to introduce ourselves. I'll go first. Hi there, I'm Taylor Grove, and I've been working with CDM Smith for the past 7 years. During this time, I have transitioned from the technical aspects of water resource engineering into project management. Now, my day-to-day tasks revolve around serving as the Compass Joint Venture Group's Regional Production Services, or RPS, Deputy Task Order Manager. In this capacity, I look to optimize schedule, cost, and quality. Now I'll turn it over to my coworker Matt to introduce himself.
Thanks, Taylor. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt McGlone. I've been with CDM Smith now for over 10 years. I'm located in Denver, Colorado, and serve as the Regional Technical Coordinator for FEMA Region 8 as part of the Compass JV. I've been involved in FEMA mapping projects dating back now to map modernization phase. My background is in GIS, floodplain management, and project management. Now I'll turn it over to my coworker Sydney to introduce herself.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Rao, and I have been with CDM Smith for 9 years. I'm located in Austin, Texas, and I support the Region 6 RSC as part of the Compass JV. I've been involved in FEMA flood studies since 2012, starting out as a production team member, moving to technical lead, and then on to project management and now program management, which is what brings us all here today. We're very excited to share our experiences with all of you, so I hope you enjoy.
Well, now that you have some background information on us, let's move forward with today's agenda. Today's agenda has been curated especially for you. We want to delve into the difficulties often experienced by the presence of third-party data in the risk map environment. First, I will cover the Golden Triangle and what it represents. Next, Matt will introduce the conundrum, which many of you may already be familiar with. Then, we will each cover a solution scenario to tackle this very real problem. Last of all, Sydney will wrap it up with our conclusions and open it up for questions if time allows. What is the Golden Triangle? Well, there are many famous triangles in today's world. Let's see, we have the Bermuda Triangle, Pascal's Triangle, and more local to our conference this year is the Research Triangle, which consists of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. However, today we're going to use the Golden Triangle of project management. Well, this project management tool has been referred to as the Iron Triangle, the Time Cost Quality Triangle, and even the Triangle of Balance. We're going to stick with the Golden Triangle for our purposes. Now, it is important to note that Project Management Institute does use time, cost, and scope in their version of the triangle. So several of our scenarios will also cover scope in addition to time, cost, and quality. And full disclosure, folks, the Golden Triangle will not solve your problems, but it will make your priorities clear and help you choose the path that is best for your project. Now, the idea of the Golden Triangle is that you want to produce the best quality product that you can in the shortest amount of time that you can for as low of a cost as you can. Some people will say time, quality, cost, pick two. It doesn't have to be that harsh, but it is extremely difficult to achieve all three in perfect harmony. As we go further into our discussion, Matt will cover the challenges that we face when it comes to managing projects with third-party data and the scenarios that are available for you to choose the right route for you and your project.
Thanks, Taylor. Let's start with defining the problem or conundrum. So what you're looking at on this slide is the overall FEMA risk map lifecycle. Many are probably already familiar with these processes, so I won't go through each in detail, but rather point out the major phases of project planning, discovery and base level engineering, data development, preliminary issuance, post-preliminary due process, and post-preliminary final mapping. Throughout the risk map lifecycle, there may be various phases that include project transitions. Today, we're going to be talking about arguably the most common transition point in projects, which is between data development and preliminary issuance. This is a critical transition point where the mapping partner focus shifts from data development tasks such as hydrology, hydraulics, and floodplain mapping to the regulatory tasks in preparation for preliminary issuance. Project transitions can be challenging, and ensuring effective QA/QCs occur at this point is critical to overall project success. There are various types of QA/QCs that occur at this transition point that range from in-house through the regional service center or intake reviews occurring during preliminary phase. Today we will highlight 3 different solution scenarios in no particular order and talk through the pros and cons that each includes. Solution number 1's main objective is to have a true independent review performed by the Regional Service Center during data development. Under the Regional Production Support Task Order, the PTS reviews all data development deliverables from CTPs and their contractors. The reviews are conducted during the data development phase of the risk map lifecycle. Under the RPS task order, these reviews are funded as RSC enhancements. The reviews are conducted on base map, terrain, hydrology, hydraulics, floodplain mapping, and base level engineering deliverables. Reviews are completed through the MIP under the associated independent QA/QC tasks. This provides a location to upload review documents as well as track schedule and budget for the review. This solution does include both pros and cons. First, to go over the pros, the reviews performed by the RSC are truly independent third-party reviews. The data development reviews build on each other. For example, hydrology is reviewed and approved before hydraulics is initiated. Hydraulics is then reviewed and approved before floodplain mapping. This significantly cuts back on rework. The reviews are conducted during the data development. This ensures that responsible contractors are in place and able to engage in meetings and conference calls to talk through potential issues. Finally, potential major issues are identified during data development, prior to the start of the regulatory process. This avoids potential revised preliminaries and due process issues that often lead to schedule delays and additional costs. This solution does include several cons though. The detailed reviews typically add between 90 and 120 days to the project schedules, allowing for the initial technical review and responses and back checks thereafter. There is an increased cost for the PTS to conduct the reviews. Also, there is potential for these reviews to cause disruptions in working relationships. The checklists are developed and based off of FEMA standards and guidelines, but some areas inevitably fall into engineering judgment and could lead to technical disagreement. I will now kick it back over to Taylor to talk through solution number 2.
Thank you, Matt. Now, solution scenario number 2 is a common path in today's risk map process. On this path, the mapping partner is wearing 2 hats, if you will, one hat for development and one for the QA/QC. In an attempt to avoid bias, the internal review likely takes place after all scoped data development work is finished. Since the review coincides so well with the data development timeframe, the review is also funded under data development. Now, it is important to note that these reviews will cover the whole gambit, from the base map task all the way through flood risk products, even floodplain mapping if applicable. It is also important to note that QA/QC for each task being reviewed is tracked for schedule and budget within the MIP. Now, based on the information I provided you, were you able to sleuth out which aspects of the golden triangle were valued the most on this path? If you guessed time and cost as being the most controlling aspects, you were right. Choosing the route where the mapping partner wears 2 hats, including the internal QA/QC hat, issues are able to be identified within the data development realm and not later down the line in regulatory phases. Additionally, the review time is significantly condensed since coordination and communication all take place under one roof. Now, on the flip side, quality may be in jeopardy. I'm not saying that's impossible to perform an unbiased review in-house. It is simply more difficult than having an external party when it comes to unbiased quality. Furthermore, because the workflow is so smooth with keeping the project under one roof while in data development, there is a risk that the reviews all take place at the same time. This can cause a ripple effect that can significantly impact the project delivery. Now, is this the right scenario for your project? It might be. If not, maybe the next solution scenario presented by Sydney is the key for you.
Thanks, Taylor. Another approach to this review gap problem is to fund the data development review under the regulatory product scope. In this workflow, the data development contractor completes their scope deliverables, and then when the project is scoped for the regulatory phase, which begins with the draft firm task, the regulatory contractor performs an intake review on the data development materials. The review is funded within the regulatory product scope, and it can also extend to the surrounding areas to confirm that elevation and inundation tie-ins are correct to both effective mapping and any other new modeling within the study footprint. There are several pros and cons to this approach. The largest benefit is often that the regulatory products team is best positioned to catch errors or omissions that may cause problems for the regulatory process down the road. Whereas the data development team may not be as well versed in that context for the study materials. Additionally, the review is limited to the items that will eventually form the regulatory products. So that is both a pro and a con. It means that the review is more targeted and saves time, but it also means that if perhaps only one county out of a watershed study is funded for regulatory products, the areas outside of that county may not undergo an external review for quite some time. If the rest of the watershed is picked up later for regulatory products, the original team may no longer be on hand to answer questions. Another con is that this approach means that the review occurs after the data development contract scope has concluded. So the data development contractor may end up working out of scope if the review reveals issues that require remodeling. It can become an iterative process and cost more than initially intended. Overall, the balance in this approach is often a higher cost in order to gain quality and time. This presentation demonstrates there will always be trade-offs and that every region and every study is unique. Today, we've discussed 3 approaches: third-party data reviews completed by the RSC, self-funded independent reviews, and data development reviews completed by the regulatory contractor. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to bridging the gap between data development and regulatory product phases. So I hope that these solutions offer up some items to consider in other quests to strike the perfect balance within the golden triangle of cost, schedule, and quality. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll now open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Taylor, Sydney, and Matt. That was great. I know that really hit home for me as a task order manager and project manager through many projects. I've seen each of these solutions and pros and cons play out in various different ways. So I know they can be a tricky situation transitioning from one partner to another. I don't see any questions, but if anyone has them, please get them in. I'll throw one to you, Taylor. What do you think about tailoring your solution depending on the partner that's involved? Some CTPs are pretty advanced, and some are maybe still getting familiar with some of the specifications of the FEMA program.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely up to the CTP and the scenario you're given and all the players, because every situation is unique, and we've seen that time and time again. So you really do have to customize it and tailor it to your best approach and what truly is your priority for that project.
Great, thanks. We do have a question come in from Marshall Rivers. Thanks, Marshall. Question is, how do you arbitrate issues between third parties and PTS? Typically, budget constraints make these conversations extra difficult.
I can probably take that one. Yeah, that is probably one of the challenges. You know, I covered scenario 1, and we a lot of times have that come up. I think the benefit to having the QA/QCs ran during data development is that the conversations can be held between the contractors, the CTPs, the PTS, and even the region can get involved in those as well. So that's what we've seen that I think work out pretty well in that solution.
Great, thanks, Matt. No additional questions. So if anyone has anyone, get it in now, or we're going to move on to the next presentation. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
All right, our next presentation is called The Forgotten P, Reviving Mitigation Planning, Technical Assistance in Risk Mapping, Assessment, and Planning, otherwise known as Risk Map. It's going to be presented by Traci Murray, who's with Atkins, North America. Traci is currently a senior technical coordinator at Atkins. Traci has more than 8 years of technical production with extensive experience analyzing environmental data, hazard resiliency, and floodplain management. Much of her experience has been leading community outreach for state and local CTPs, including helping those programs develop effective outreach plans to increase flood risk awareness. Traci joined ASFPM and the Georgia Association of Floodplain Managers in spring 2010, and since 2016, she served as GAFM's treasurer and conference chair. In addition to her voluntary efforts with GAFM, Traci also serves as the Junior League of Atlanta's Coalition Strategies Council, supporting the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council's statewide Human Trafficking Task Force and Georgia's Appleseed Healthy Housing Project. Traci is a proud resident of Cobb County, where she resides with her husband and 3 daughters.
Hello, ASFPM, and welcome to The Forgotten P, Reviving Mitigation Planning, Technical Assistance, and Risk Map. My name is Traci Murray, and I am a Senior Technical Coordinator at Atkins. This presentation will cover the HMGP Synergy Project background that took us down the path to discovering mitigation planning, technical assistance, and risk map. It should be noted that mitigation planning technical assistance will also be referred to as MPTA throughout this presentation. Next, we will explore some of our recommendations for reviving MPTA and risk map while examining some of the successes and barriers of incorporating MPTA activities. We will then provide information on the MPTA ordering process to help demystify how it is scoped in risk map. Before we jump into this, I think adding a bit of historical context is important to understanding the overall framework of the project. The risk map guidance for incorporating mitigation planning, technical assistance, and training into flood risk projects was first issued in 2011 to enhance the P in risk map and really demonstrate how project teams can provide communities with mitigation planning technical assistance throughout the risk map project lifecycle. Revised in 2018 to incorporating mitigation planning technical assistance into risk map projects, this document further expands on mitigation planning technical assistance activities to focus on building the capability of the community to plan for and reduce risk. The Risk Map HMGP Synergies Project was the catalyst for exploration of MPTA and Risk Map. In spring 2019, STARR began research for a project that examined the potential synergies between the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and Risk Map. We interviewed different groups across the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, also known as FEMA, to better understand connections, shared goals, materials, and activities that could be shared with the risk map. Mitigation planning technical assistance was identified as an activity that could assist communities with prioritizing grant-ready projects. So to find out more, we asked project teams to complete an MPTA survey. The intent was to gain insight on how project teams perform activities related to incorporating MPTA into risk map projects. The survey questions were designed to capture knowledge, communication gaps, possible training tools, and best practices. But surveys have limitations. There is really but so much one can capture. So, to take things a step further and get more information on how we can promote and enhance the incorporation of MPTA in RISMAP, and in general, see how we can connect communities with resources and data they need to take action to reduce risk. We sat down to talk to project teams about how MPTA is currently being used and incorporated in RISMAP. So let's take a look at the information captured through these surveys and interviews that informed our belief that mitigation planning technical assistance has become the forgotten P in RISMAP. We asked survey participants to select the options that best describe their role so we could identify area perspectives and which roles may have a higher value and understanding of incorporating MPTA into RISMAP. Planners make up 34% of our responders. So what does that suggest? Do planners just get it? Do they see the value in incorporating MPTA into RISMAP? Or perhaps we did not hear from participants in other roles because they may have felt that they did not have the knowledge and understand to thoughtfully complete the survey. To identify possible subject matter experts, liaisons, and mentors, as well as possible knowledge gaps in communication across regions and roles, we asked participants to select the answer that best describes their knowledge of incorporating mitigation planning technical assistance into RISMAP. Over 70% of respondents have at least some knowledge of incorporating MPTA into RISMAP. 16% have no knowledge of incorporating MPTA into RISMAP. Next, we asked which RISMAP phases would one typically incorporate mitigation planning technical assistance to determine which RISMAP phase project teams are currently incorporating MPTA. 61% say all phases. Of those who selected a single phase, 32% selected discovery and 35% selected resilience as opportune phases to incorporate MPTA. Few see the engineering review meeting and the CCO meeting as typical times to incorporate MPTA. Finally, to identify where MPTA is or is not a component of flood risk projects, we asked participants if mitigation planning technical assistance is a component of every flood risk project. The results here were rather polarizing. 46% of our participants do not believe MPTA is a component of every flood risk project, with responses like, it can be, but is often not scoped and is completely ignored by CTPs. And if it is supposed to be, it definitely is not a focus. One participant wrote, I'm a planner serving as a RISMAP PM, and we almost never talk about mitigation planning technical assistance. We realized we really needed to have some in-depth conversations about what is going on with mitigation planning technical assistance in RISMAP. So it's here that we sat down with our survey participants and others that were identified during the survey to hear more. To understand why MPTA is not being incorporated, we asked, why do you believe mitigation planning technical assistance is not largely a part of every RISMAP project? This quote summarizes the overall sentiment of interview participants. Mitigation planning technical assistance just needs to be clear in terms of assistance that it can provide. Since it is done through RISMAP, CTPs need to understand how to scope it into their projects so that it becomes a standard practice, not an afterthought. So we started examining the initial documents and touch points CTPs and project teams reviewed during scoping and the initial phases of RISMAP project planning to identify where MPTA is or is not discussed in a clear and functional way. The idea is to get CTPs and project teams to start thinking about the benefits of incorporating MPTA into risk map early and often with the use of new and existing risk map forms and literature. Now, we need to preface the next few slides by saying planners are not solely responsible for the incorporation of MPTA in risk map. But again, P is for planning. And as demonstrated through their participation and the information they provided throughout this project, planners are the continuity piece that can provide a holistic picture that community stakeholders can understand and appreciate. They are skilled at translating technical data and leveraging risk map resources to inspire action to advance mitigation. And therefore, planners appear to be our best champions for incorporating MPTA into risk map. Now, let's continue with our next question. When asked, what are some successes and barriers of incorporating MPTA into risk map? We heard that when planners are involved in the initial phases of risk map, greater success is seen with incorporating MPTA, and that when MPTA is introduced early as part of a risk map project, it is easier to incorporate during subsequent risk map touchpoints. Unfortunately, planners are not often included during the project planning phase discussions. There are also various risk map meeting planning formats used by regions and CTPs. CTPs will largely invite local planners, but often neglect to coordinate with their regional mitigation planning team. With no national standard meeting format that requires MPTA to be addressed, it has proven difficult for planners to push and promote MPTA discussions. So simply decoded, we hear early and frequent planner involvement may result in the successful implementation of MPTA in risk map. So we have heard a lot so far. CTP lack of awareness about MPTA, thus not being scoped, the failure to get the right folks in the room, and now the desire of the communities to only want to talk about the maps. I really like this quote from Jenny. She says, there is just not enough oxygen in the room left to discuss MPTA during risk map meetings. We heard throughout our interviews that communities only want to talk about the maps. And without the Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee members present and others that can speak to the importance of discussing MPTA during risk map meetings, it is difficult to steer the conversation toward the use of leveraging flood risk data for hazard mitigation planning. Lastly, we asked for concrete supportive examples of the successful implementation of MPTA in risk map to get buy-in. We know that local examples are more likely to result in buy-in and promote implementation in neighboring jurisdictions. But examples of other states and regions are also beneficial. We were told while certain regions have great approaches to getting branch chiefs, CTPs, and watershed stakeholders to buy into incorporating MPTA into risk map, others struggle with providing solid supportive evidence that MPTA is a successful tool in helping identify and aiding hazard mitigation project planning. Some successes captured include the use of real-time technical assistance, or RTTA, to raise community awareness of flood risk or advance mitigation. The mitigation benefits estimator and benefits cost analysis to estimate benefits and cost for various mitigation options have also proved to be useful. Examples of solid payouts are so important. With so many products, CTPs have a hard time prioritizing funds. Better talking points at each risk map touchpoint help drive MPTA conversations and get mitigation planners acting. Now that we have heard some of the successes and barriers that come with trying to incorporate MPTA into risk map, let's explore some recommendations that may help project teams revive MPTA and risk map. This section describes our recommendations for how we can revive MPTA and risk map. It is organized by the major risk map touchpoints with communities and integration categories, which describe the type of recommended integration. Risk map touchpoints include discovery, flood risk review, CCO meeting and open house, and the resilience meetings. Integration categories consist of stakeholder message, communications materials, activities, risk and solutions, and desired outcomes. The discovery phase during a risk map project offers a touch point to start conversations around the best approach for planning technical assistance and for hazard mitigation planning. This is a great time post-scoping to inform or remind CTPs, project teams, and communities that FEMA provides mitigation planning technical assistance through the risk map process. Now, for CTPs, known scope and budget information must be included in the community outreach and mitigation strategy and the mapping activity statement. We will get more into that in the next section, but additional mitigation planning technical assistance projects can be determined throughout the risk map project lifecycle and added to CTP planning documents. A quarterly watershed project newsletter with noteworthy information about risk map and MPTA connections can be circulated to communities prior to the discovery meeting and throughout the risk map engagement cycle. But caution, discovery can be overwhelming for some communities. A lot of information is both given and requested during this phase. To mitigate the risk that mitigation messages are lost in the information provided, we recommend sending relevant data requests and reference materials well ahead of the discovery meeting. By including MPTA discussions in the discovery phase, the project team provides the foundation for embedding MPTA ideation throughout the risk map project lifecycle. This foundation will support the next steps that build on the initial message that risk map products help guide and support the hazard mitigation planning process. During the flood risk review meeting, there is an opportunity for the watershed stakeholders and the project team to look beyond the maps and have conversations about the impacts and consequences that can help planning team members. During this phase, the stakeholder message is centered around a review of the revised risk and knowing the interests and concerns captured during the discovery phase. At flood risk review, it is recommended that project teams work with communities to review GIS datasets for incorporation into hazard mitigation plan risk assessments. Create a document that highlights impacts or consequences that may help planning team members champion the development, maintenance, or update of a hazard mitigation plan. The CCO meeting is a good time for the mitigation planning team to plan for how the new flood mapping data will be incorporated into the hazard mitigation plan. The message to stakeholders in this phase is about the flood risk they face, the implementations of an action to reduce that risk, and the benefits of the actions the community plans to take. It may be difficult to steer the attention away from the new regulatory products in this phase. Include a station set up with displays staffed by MPTA subject matter experts. If resilience discussions are possible, demonstrate why mitigation is important and how mitigation can be beneficial. Share success stories of communities that work together to secure resources to complete mitigation projects. At this phase, citizens now know the status of their community's hazard mitigation planning process and what steps their community officials are taking to protect them against flood loss. Finally, we end this section with resilience. While resilience is emphasized during all the risk map meetings, the resilience meeting focuses on measuring the capacity for implementing priority mitigation activities within the watershed, making it a great time to discuss mitigation actions. We encourage communities to take sustained action to reduce or eliminate long-term risks to people and property from flood hazards beyond the term of the risk map process. Citizens are relying on local and state officials to help reduce their flood risk and associated cost. If discussions about mitigation activities were not feasible in earlier phases of risk map due to regulatory product rollout, the materials and activities referenced in those earlier phases can be implemented at this stage. Communities should now feel equipped to use risk map products in mitigation planning, thus ultimately increasing the likelihood of communities having approved hazard mitigation plans and being eligible for HMGP grant funding. Now we have come to the final section of this presentation, where we would like to provide some information about the MPTA ordering process. Mitigation planning technical assistance is listed as a fundable task under both PM and COMS activities. Activities under these tasks are to assist local governments in preparing to undertake or plan for some mitigation activity. They must be coordinated with the appropriate FEMA office to ensure that technical assistance provided in support of mitigation planning is not duplicated in other tasks within CTP program or other mitigation planning grants provided by FEMA. Recipients must ensure that technical assistance activities proposed in the COMSO are focused on support related to community engagement, risk communication, and identifying and or advancing mitigation action, and that these activities are not duplicated in the program management cell. According to the Incorporating Mitigation Planning, Technical Assistance into Risk Map Projects guidance, the region mitigation planning, engineering, and risk analysis staff should work together to finalize the selection of technical assistance activities. The regional mitigation planning staff should then work with the regional staff members responsible for procuring production activities. The following activities should be completed to appropriately order technical assistance or training. Define the scope of the technical assistance. Identify deliverables such as technical assistance and or an AOMI dataset. Develop a schedule and develop a cost estimate. Under risk map, mitigation planning technical assistance is envisioned to be a component of every flood risk project. Now, ideally, MPTA would be scoped in each risk map project because we know that hazard mitigation is cost effective. For every $1 spent on federal mitigation grants, $6 is saved in future damages. As we have discussed throughout this presentation, both the risk map project teams and community stakeholders face challenges with incorporating MPTA and risk map. One could argue that these challenges likely contribute to the outcome of communities lacking enough prioritized grant-ready projects at the time of a disaster, leaving them unable to take advantage of HMGP. This is why mitigation planning technical assistance must be revived in risk map, with providing clear understanding of MPTA and its benefits to project teams, CTPs, and watershed stakeholders. We can help risk map achieve its vision of mitigation planning technical assistance in risk map. The guidance documents shown here helped inform this presentation. For information on mitigation planning technical assistance, please visit www.fema.gov. This concludes the presentation of the Forgotten P, Reviving Mitigation Planning Technical Assistance in Risk Map. Let's go live for some Q&A.
Traci, thanks so much for that great presentation. Definitely risk map would not be the same without planning.
Yes.
The risk map, right? So we do have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
First one comes from Michael Mearslaw at the California State Floodplain Manager. He says, given that some states like my own separate the floodplain management and FIP related services from the state hazard mitigation planning, the Stafford Act functions, perhaps strengthening federal protocols for representatives of these efforts to be embedded in other activities would help.
Yeah, Mike, I totally agree with that. As we mentioned earlier on in the presentation, with there not being kind of this national format in terms of, who is invited to these meetings, like how it should be coordinated, then, that does kind of pose a bit of a problem. But I think that, project teams relying on each other, which consist of course, our NFIP coordinators and our state hazard mitigation officers coming together to help communities, kind of really solve these problems. So if they're not working with each other, then, certainly maybe you or others can kind of be that bridge and, putting that into a regulation is a bit above us, right? And certainly something we can take, to FEMA and others as recommendations. But I think that, we can do definitely our part without having, those that legislation in place or, those regulatory factors, in place. And we certainly can do our part to make sure that we're working collaboratively to make sure that, mitigation planning technical assistance is in fact incorporated in risk map.
Great, thanks. We have a couple more coming in. David Knight asks, the whole risk map lifecycle takes so long and convoluted. PMs are always looking for pieces of the project to leave behind. Mitigation pieces are an obvious part to drop. How do you address that?
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely. I totally agree. And as you heard throughout the presentation, that certainly is a problem. We say risk map, right? It's mapping, assessment, and planning, right? But within those components, there are these additional layers and elements. And like anything that is buried or layered, it can eventually become, the forgotten, right? So it's good to have these type of projects where we're checking back in and saying, is this still relevant, right? Does this still speak to what we're doing today? If it was addressed or implemented back 10 years ago, right? So having those check-ins definitely help. Jenny spoke to there not being enough oxygen in the room, people just only wanting to talk about the maps, and that really comes back to the promotion and setting up and project planning and discovery, putting and priming that mind to say, this is an element of it, this is a component. Not just something that you can, add in that could potentially be beneficial. No, this really is beneficial, and this is how, this will benefit your community. We're asking a lot of our stakeholders. We're giving them information and providing them with data and asking them to be a bit clairvoyant, right? Looking into the future. And that's not something people naturally want to do. So it is difficult. But, as sitting on project teams and being a part of that, that's part of our job, is to kind of be that guide, right? To take communities, meet them where they are, and then, elevate them to where they need to be. So I hope that addresses your question. If not, I'll be at the Atkins booth at 3 o'clock. We can definitely chat more about it.
Great, thanks. We have time for another one or here. This comes from Diana. Is it expected that CTPs undertaking these activities will have a planner on staff?
Yes, definitely should have a planner. I mean, as throughout the presentation, we said, planners are our champions, right? They see the holistic picture of, how the data should be incorporated and how it can, the application of it, right? Largely, you have your engineers and GIS professionals there, and naturally people are going to speak to their passions, right? And planners are very passionate about what they do. So you want to have that additional element there to really push and drive additional components of risk map.
Great, thanks. Next one comes from Jamie. Says it would be helpful to have more materials or training for CTPs and state FPAs to help facilitate this discussion with local communities. We've attempted resilience meetings with all stakeholders, but like Michael mentions, not only do states separate planning and risk maps, so do many communities.
Yes, and there are a couple of documents that I actually shared throughout the presentation, and I'll also link a couple after we're done wrapping up question and answers. But like, yeah, I totally agree, and we're certainly working on, making sure that a lot of that language is included within risk map documents to kind of script out things, right? Like, at these meetings, again, there's so much information being provided, and so many different ways that they can go and be tailored, but having those scripts and speaking to communities no matter which phase they are within their hazard mitigation planning process, that we are directing them in a way that is proven beneficial and solid in providing that information. So yes, scripts and information, I agree, are totally beneficial. All those communication channels that we have, which we have a ton, is just making sure that we're really cross-pollinating and making sure that we're adding all those elements within those documents. So more to come on that.
Great, thanks. Looks like we may have more time for one more. This one comes from LB. What if your region does not use CTPs for production? How would you approach things differently with regards to MBTA?
Oh, that's a great question. So during the project planning phase, the project management engineer should be really looking to see whether or not mitigation planning technical assistance would be beneficial for that community. So certainly working with the study PM to kind of address those issues and questions is also an option. So yes, I hope that addresses that as well. It's not just the CTPs. Yeah, you can also work with your PM.
Yeah, and this is a similar one from Chris. It says, outside of CTPs, how do we encourage MTPA incorporation within FEMA-led mapping projects? CTPs don't lead all mapping projects nationwide.
Yeah, again, it's really going to start at the project planning phase, making sure that, we're, as we're going through discovery and finding out about the community, reviewing hazard mitigation plans, that, we're identifying those needs and saying, I think that this community would definitely benefit from mitigation planning technical assistance, and, meeting with FPAs and stakeholders to, inform them about that process. Anyone else? Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin, did you have someone else?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you thought there should be like a set aside bucket of money for MPTA.
Certainly. Again, we mentioned that, CTPs and others have like a hard time prioritizing funds. So certainly that would be ideal to set that money aside. We're definitely, working on making sure that, again, we get buy-in and that we can prove that, this is in fact a good use of funds. So if you have success stories, I'll link sites and platforms that you can use, and contact people that you can contact in order to say, this is working well for us, and that we are sharing best practices. So as we're promoting this, that certainly is kind of our sales pitch. We can say, in this region with this community, these are the successes that they have had, and showing the real benefits of it, so that CTPs are more likely to say, hey, I see this, let's go, let's make sure that we're doing this.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
One more from Michael, the California State Floodplain Manager. One, he shares a quote modified from Yogi Berra's baseball quote. He says, mitigation is 90% planning and the other half is execution.
Absolutely. Yeah,
then
definitely.
He also has a question about, has there been any thoughts to updating the Unified National Program for Floodplain Management to stress the importance of mitigation planning?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not privy to that at this point in time. I can certainly ask around. If you want to, again, meet me at the booth at 3 o'clock Central Time, I would love to discuss that further. I think that's an excellent idea.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions we have in today. Thanks, Traci.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
All right, up next, we have a presentation titled Leveraging Local Mapping Needs into FEMA's Discovery Process, a Discovery Needs Ranking System Overview. Presenting today is Emily Whitehead and Annie Dobson from Stantec. Emily Whitehead is a project manager with the Cincinnati, Ohio office, part of the STARR 2 joint venture. She's in her 18th year of professional practice in GIS and flood risk identification and hazard mapping. Emily has a Bachelor of Science degree in geography from Ohio University and an information technology certificate in web development from the University of Cincinnati. Over the past 17 years, Emily has been active in FEMA's MapMod and risk map programs throughout the United States, focusing on project management, floodplain mapping, DFIRM production, quality control, and community outreach. Andy Dobson is a senior planner with Stantec. He's over 20 years professional planning experience working with local government, county government, and private consultants. Projects Andy has worked on include land development regulation, community engagement, comprehensive planning, nonprofit administration, transportation planning, floodplain management, and GIS mapping applications. Currently, Andy's working on FEMA risk map projects, building community awareness and information tools related to various natural hazards.
My name is Emily Whitehead. I am a project manager with Stantec Consulting, and Stantec is part of the STARR 2 FEMA joint venture. With me today is Andy Dobson, and he will be co-presenting with me, and I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself. Andy?
Good morning. I'm Andy Dobson, also with Stantec. I'm a senior planner working on hazard mitigation and floodplain mapping projects. I'm here today with Emily to talk about discovery needs rankings. And back to you.
Thanks, Andy.
Yep.
As Andy said, we're talking about a discovery needs ranking system that we came up with some time ago during our first discovery watershed project. And this is an approach that we have been using on some of our larger watersheds during discovery. And we'll go into this and explain how leveraging this approach leverages local mapping needs into a discovery needs ranking system. On our next slide here, we've got the risk map timeline, which I'm sure a lot of folks online today are familiar with, but just in case you are not, we are talking today about the discovery phase of risk map. And as you can see on screen here, discovery is the second portion of the planning phase that kicks off at the beginning of risk map. Also, potentially as a refresher, in case anyone in the room has already been through discovery, or those that haven't, the main objective of discovery is to record mapping needs and comments from stakeholders that participate in discovery. And depending on how many stakeholders participate, the needs could be submitted from multiple communities or counties, or perhaps other organizations locally, regionally, or on the state level. We encourage our stakeholders to think about streams or areas that could benefit from new or updated flood studies, or potentially benefit from enhanced risk map products such as water surface elevation grids or depth grids, or another example would be changes since last firm. The problem that we seem to run into with some of our larger watersheds during discovery is that we are developing or gathering a really long list of stream needs in many cases. And especially in a larger watershed where you have some good active participation from numerous stakeholders, you may also find yourself in a situation with competing local interest needs. And we've had several watersheds in the past decade or so where so many needs have been gathered that there hasn't been enough funding to address all of the needs. Another problem we've run into is that typically regions will have more than one project funded in a fiscal year, and so you could run into a situation of competing regional projects as well. So our solution that we developed is a discovery needs ranking system that is quantifiable, and it assigns a numerical value to each of the discovery needs that are gathered. And we use this ranking system to help prioritize the discovery needs as fairly as possible. Prioritizing these discovery needs helps us to meet risk map objectives, both regulatory and non-regulatory, and it has proved to be a cost-effective solution that factors in local input as part of the solution.
Never enough money to go around for these studies.
Yeah, never enough money. Yep. So we wanted to quickly touch on, before we jump into the details of the ranking system, we wanted to quickly touch on FEMA's Coordinated Needs Management Strategy, or CNMS. Hopefully the folks on the line are familiar with CNMS, but we wanted to touch on it because this is one of the factors of our ranking system. And just quickly here, that overview. CNMS is a geospatial inventory of FEMA's flood studies, and also a repository for mapping needs or community requests that are submitted outside of the discovery phase. And on the next slide, you'll see a graphic that shows the various elements of the CNMS database.
Shows a lot of elements.
yeah. Not only the geospatial aspect of it there in GIS, but also on the right, you see some of the feature classes that store this inventory. We'll be focusing on the study needs, or excuse me, the S studies line feature class in particular, which contains, if you look at the bottom of the screen, a validation status, which is an attribute of that feature class. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that the validation status, here are 4 categories of CNMS validation status. In particular, we work with, in the discovery needs system, we're focusing on the valid, unverified, or unknown validation status streams. On our next slide, in addition to CNMS, these are some other example input data sets that have been used in the past when employing this discovery needs ranking system. Average annualized loss, or AAL, which is a HAZIS output data set, can be used in some areas. And we discussed CNMS, but to specifically talk about the point values, in the past, if a stream need is in CNMS and is identified as, say, unverified or unknown status, then we suggest adding 3 points to the score of that stream need. Another ranking system input is local mapping needs, which we'll go into more detail later. We also have some example data sets here, area of mitigation interest, which could help prioritize the needs, critical facilities, and leverage data. We'll go into these in more detail in the next slides, but what we do is we work with a discovery core team and the core team consists of members of the FEMA region or, say, state partners, and we work with them to determine which data sets make sense to use for the ranking system for each unique watershed.
Yeah, a little different everywhere we go.
Yeah. So on our next slide here, we wanted to talk about local input and how that can influence this ranking system. So we will have a discovery meeting or discovery process in which we ask the participant to identify local mapping needs. And if we receive feedback, then we recommend, for example, if Turtle Creek is identified as a local mapping need, then when we end up ranking all of the studies, Turtle Creek will get 3 additional points and therefore be prioritized a little bit higher.
Pays to show up.
Yeah, it pays to show up, exactly.
Always.
Another way that we've been able to factor in local participation or input into the ranking system is with areas of mitigation interest, or as Andy will go into, areas of concern a little bit later. But if there's multiple ways to identify areas of mitigation interest or concern, and one example is a lot of times those are already identified if your community has an existing hazard mitigation plan. So we could pull those from the plan during discovery. Or sometimes, depending on the discovery scope, we ask communities to go ahead and mark areas of mitigation interest or areas of concern on the discovery map. And we use the proximity of those areas of concern to flood studies to help assign point values. So for example, if it's within a certain buffer distance of a stream need, that study will get 1 more point in our ranking system. A third on our next slide, a third local input data set that's pretty important is leverage data. And examples of leverage data are flood studies, hydrologic or hydraulic analysis studies that can be incorporated into a risk map project. For example, one quick example from our past discovery efforts is the St. Joseph River watershed was discovered in FY15, FY16. It's in Indiana and Michigan, and it has 15 counties. It covers 15 counties and over just about 200 communities. And we ended up identifying thousands of miles of stream needs. And we were lucky enough the state of Indiana had a study, Zone A study program going on, and they were able to provide hundreds of miles of Zone A studies for us to leverage. And so therefore those stream needs were ranked a little bit higher in our ranking system because that helped that was a cost-effective solution, leveraging that data. So here we have an example of a total ranking score and priority level. And again, this can vary per watershed depending on what input data sets we use as factors. But in this example, if a stream need ends up with a ranking score, total ranking score of 8 to 10 points, then we might prioritize that as a very high priority and all the way down to low priority. This is a very hard to read example from our first time we executed this ranking system. And it basically just shows you in tabular format each of the stream needs that were gathered, or examples of stream needs gathered, and the various factors, you can see them as columns, that were applied to eventually get a total ranking score or priority, which you see all the way to the right. But wanted to also emphasize that it's tabular here on screen, but it's also attributes to geospatial. So it's actually a GIS file behind this as well. On our next slide here is an example of a watershed where we ended up gathering 386 miles of study needs, which happened to fall in 134 panels. And we may have run into a situation here where there's not enough funding to execute 386 miles of new studies and update 134 panels. So on our next slide, we can take this ranking system a step further and rank our results geographically. So we haven't had to employ this in all of our watersheds that we've discovered, but it's an option to this solution. But consider the geography of the needs. For example, try to group the needs based on their HUC 12 or what firm panel they fall on. And that can kind of help you get more bang for your buck in terms of what you end up prioritizing. And again, it utilizes GIS to streamline this decision-making process for funding a future scoping, or excuse me, a future risk map project. We have a scenario here where we're recommending taking the medium, high, and very high priority streams and applying geographic factors of firm panel and HUC 12 to narrow down your prioritization. So on the next slide, you'll see where we've now, by applying scenario 1 and geographic factors, we have downgraded to 164 miles of prioritized study needs and 74 panels. And another option is scenario 2. Perhaps there's not enough funding for scenario 1. So in scenario 2, we are applying the geographic factors to just the high and very high level streams. And so on the next slide, you'll see we're now down to about 84 miles of studies and about 36 panels that will need to be updated during prelim production and final map production.
A little bit easier to fund that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so our next slide is just a summary, tabular summary of the control scenario that we discussed before at the beginning, and then scenarios 1 and 2. So it just gives some options for further ranking of the discovery needs. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Andy. He's going to talk about a specific example that we worked on in the state of New York. Andy?
Yep. Okay, so Emily's, described this ranking process that we've used. This is a fairly recent example from FEMA Region 2 in upstate, or the North Country of New York State, in the Upper Hudson River watershed. This is a illustration of where we are in the northeast corner of New York State, the North Country. This was kind of unusual in that the region underwent a discovery process across 4 different watersheds, all at the same time. It was a lot of meetings and a lot of work. Had over 185 stakeholders involved in it. This entire region, all 4 of these watersheds are almost entirely within the Adirondack State Park, which is kind of an unusual or unique situation. The park was established in the 19th century by the state of New York, primarily for wilderness protection. It's about 9,500 square miles of land, and about half of that land is in private ownership. And so the park agency ends up operating as a large regional planning and land development regulatory body. So pretty much anything that happens in the park agency is going to be involved, and they were a key stakeholder in the whole discovery process. A little bit of trivia for anyone who has heard of the Miracle on Ice, when the U.S. hockey team, in a large upset, defeated the Soviet Union and brought home the gold medal in the 1980 Winter Olympics. That happened right here in Lake Placid, New York. And my next slide here, getting away from sports trivia, is zooming in on the Upper Hudson River watershed. As I mentioned before, this is a very mountainous and forested area. This particular watershed is about 1,660 square miles. It has about 85,000 total population. Most of that is clustered into villages and resort towns along the lakes. Only 2% of the land is considered developed land, and the rest of it is state park and wooded areas. The watershed includes portions of 4 counties and 29 jurisdictions. And as I mentioned before, we had an extensive discovery process that included online interviews and questionnaires and in-person workshops. We did all this in collaboration with State of New York, FEMA Region 2, and CERC was also heavily involved in all of this. So this next slide, I am overlaying the streamlined layer on our watershed. And as you can see, we have a very complex geography, thousands of stream miles that could be involved in studies or needing to update flood hazard data. And of course, this is far too much to study and map. So we need to prioritize and focus our resources. So using our discovery process and kind of the scheme that Emily outlined previously, we begin to narrow things down and we start to add our points of concern and areas of concern developed from the discovery process. In this case, we're looking at areas of repetitive flooding, local mapping needs, other types of hazard related to, stormwater flooding or water damage and erosion. And we also learned about a unique kind of hazard in this area, ice jams, which is when a river freezes over and then the thaw comes and all that ice begins to move and it completely piles up and completely blocks a river channel. And the river simply finds a way around the ice. And whether there's a road or a bridge or a building or anything in the way, it's just going to find its way downstream. This particular hazard was a constant concern at the discovery meetings, both the damage from floodwaters and also just the physical damage, the mechanical action of the ice moving down a river. You can get 100 years worth of erosion in a week's time. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, the ice jam's a cool example of why this ranking system should be scalable, and needs to be unique to each watershed.
Yeah.
So I thought it was pretty neat too.
So when we start adding all these things up, Region 2 wanted us to use, a fairly straightforward discovery ranking system here. So as I mentioned before, we used areas and points of concern from the discovery meetings, local mapping needs. We weighed the CNMS classification fairly heavily, and then the availability of any sort of leverage data. So in this case, HAZUS data for areas of annualized loss wasn't available in this area, and the region wasn't interested in using it. We also didn't consider things like the geography of the particular panel updates and that sort of thing. We wanted to keep it fairly straightforward. So once we narrowed things down, we ended up with this. This is the final mapping output from our ranking. The red lines showing the highest priority needs, blue the next highest, and then the darker lines are the lowest priorities. And so we ended up with, a little over 40 miles that were designated for new detailed flood studies, and about 193 miles were selected for an approximate study. And, we ended up with about 234 miles worth of, stream needs identified. So we really, narrowed it down, and, I believe the region is moving forward with using this to scope new studies and, allocate funding. And, I think they were happy with, and I think we came up with a good, transparent and open, objective, process that really accommodated many stakeholders, many different points of view, and tried to, get it all down to, a sort of a mathematical output to prioritize things. So our takeaways from all of this, again, there's never going to be enough scope and budget for studying everything that needs to be done in a community. It really needs to be ranked and prioritized. And very important over and over again was the local input. showing up to the meeting and participating. I always like to say, the most powerful mitigation and planning tool is a black Sharpie marker at a public hearing, because you can, draw things on a map and show everybody what you're really concerned about. That really weighed heavily, at least in the Upper Hudson discovery process. And I think, across all of our discovery projects that we've used this system with.
Sure. Just to drive home the emphasis on local participation, we have if a community is not able to participate, they could miss out on points on the ranking scale. So it may not be 5 points. This is just for instance, in this slide, but we really just wanted to drive home that local participation can help us to influence the prioritization of discovery needs.
Show up to the meeting.
We'd like to have you there.
Yeah.
So I think that's all we have for today, right, Andy? Here's our email addresses if you have any questions after today, but I think here we'll end the presentation and go into the live question and answer session. So thanks very much for your attention.
The live Emily and Andy show coming up here. All right.
Thanks
you all
everyone.
very much.
Thanks, Emily and Andy, for that great presentation about methodology to prioritize and rank our discovery observations. We have one question so far, so those of you who have a question in your mind, please get it in the chat so Emily and Andy can answer it. First question comes from Catherine. Is there a way for the public or communities to submit requests to CNMS? Typically, we route those through the state and we submit them.
All right, thanks, Catherine, for that question. I'll start trying to answer this one. Andy, chime in, please, if you obviously have any input. But I'd say if you're in the discovery phase, obviously public or community needs could be submitted to the discovery core team at a meeting or throughout the process. But if we're talking about outside of discovery, specific to getting those requests into CNMS, I think while I'm not a CNMS lead, my best guess would be if it's a public comment, to route that through the community in which the public is a member, or as you mentioned, Catherine, submitting those to the state, and the FEMA region is also an option, and those will ultimately get routed to the regional service center, who I believe maintains and updates that CNMS database.
And you can always get a hold of FEMA Mapping and Insurance Exchange, the FEMIX number, or FMIX, excuse me, it used to be FEMIX, 877 FEMA map. I think they will at least get you in contact with a map specialist who might be able to help you out. It's kind of interesting because there's a lot of opportunity for direct, public interfacing with CNMS kinds of administration there. So, certainly if you ever see one of us there for a discovery meeting, getting in touch with us too, and getting lines drawn on a map is always a good way too.
Yeah, my bet would be that the FMIX would then route that request to the regional service center. For update of the database. So thanks for that question.
So the question I have, where have you applied this needs ranking system throughout the country?
Yeah, good question. I'll start out. We've used it. We early on, we used it quite a bit in FEMA Region 5, in the states of Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, among some others. And then Andy, you touched on how we've used it up in Region 2, right?
Yeah, that was the only time I've used the system directly, but indirectly with St. Joseph watershed, which you mentioned, in the presentation. We did a lot of, there was several different things we were ranking and using a similar kind of algorithm through that.
Mm-hmm. We've also used it up in Region 10 as well. Some of the discovery areas in Region 10 are smaller, and so we haven't had to employ it quite as often, but we have used it there. And but I guess the front runner, if you will, is where we've used it the most is in FEMA Region 5.
Great, thanks. Just another one above my head is, do you do this all in ArcGIS, or is this some like building on CNMS, or do you use this in Excel? How do you actually implement your ranking?
This how do we implement the system? We right now, you touched on it. We use ArcGIS or ArcMap, and we follow a step-by-step process to kind of overlay the various layers or factors that are being used in the ranking system. And at times we'll export to Excel as well and use that application. I've always had a wish list item or dream of automating this needs ranking system, and having some kind of Python script or GIS toolbar that instead of having to manually
there's a lot of handwork that goes on.
Yeah, it would be nice to sort of have a tool that streamlines this ranking system. So I hope to be able to implement that someday.
We need some clever Python programmers.
And we've got them, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would
All
be
right,
neat.
room to grow.
Yeah. The
We got a
future of the
question come
ranking.
in from Bob. He says, do you try to fill in gaps in selected priority reaches or factor in things such as effective BFE mismatches and et cetera?
Ooh, that's a really great idea. That would probably, I don't know that we've used those, gaps or BFE mismatches unless perhaps it was captured if the local community mentioned it, or if CNMS, if it was identified in the CNMS database as an issue with a study. But I think that's a great example of how we could scale this ranking system for specific areas or issues.
It's very flexible, so you can plug in all kinds of things. Yeah.
Great, thanks. That's all the questions we have today. I think all of our presenters will be available through their contact information, and we appreciate the presentations today and all the good questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kevin.